welcome. And thank you very much for taking the time for this dialogue. We have done a few interviews in recent years in which we talked, among others, about the danger of populist leaders like Donald Trump is. So now Donald Trump has reached the end of his term. I would suggest you starting here. What is the legacy that Donald Trump leaves behind to the American people?
Well, he leaves behind a legacy of poison. There have always been extremist elements in the United States, as there are almost everywhere. But I think Trump's presidency has made them all more vocal, more noisy about what they believe, and has made them feel as though they have the right to express hideous and unattractive and dangerous tendencies very publicly. So when Donald Trump was elected, I think a lot of people thought that he was a populist and a buffoon. Mm-hmm. But of course, people thought that Hitler was a buffoon too in his early days. And since being elected, Trump has been, I don't use the word lightly, but I think has really stirred up a lot of evil in the United States. I think he's made people who are racists feel justified in their racism. I think he has a vision of an America in which a white working class continues to be in a superior position to people of other ethnicities who have worked very hard to achieve things. I think he wants to move away from tolerance of every kind so that people can place the blame for their own problems on other groups and can say the reason that I don't make more money is because of immigrants. The reason I don't make more money is because it's all being spent on politically correct issues like, I don't know, race and equal representation for race, or gay people, or Jews, or whoever else is being targeted at any given moment. So far as I'm concerned, the moment when it really became clear where he was headed was when there were riots in Charlottesville in 2017, I believe it was. And he said, well, there were good people on both sides. And there weren't good people on both sides. There was one side that was peaceful, who were peaceful and who wanted to see justice and democracy in America. And there was another side that was murderous and full of rage and wanted to destroy those most fundamental of American democratic norms. And from that point onward, he has stirred up into a frenzy the incipient hatred that was in all of the people who were in his populist coalition. And he has also created, which I think is extremely dangerous, and is again an old tool of propaganda, a complete disregard for truth. So that a lot of what was once understood to be, fairly accurate representation of the media no longer is. If he didn't like something, he just said it wasn't true. Mm-hmm. And if he wanted people to think something, he just said that it was true. And the effect, and I think his intention, though I don't know that he had the conscious understanding to articulate it, but his intention was not merely to destroy people's faith in a particular truth. It wasn't merely that this event was not as portrayed. It was eventually to break down any kind of trust in the mainstream media altogether, and to suggest to a large body of people that whatever they were gathering from social media and whatever they were gathering from his Twitter feed was the only thing to believe, and that all of the careful, meticulous, energetic reporting being done by American journalists it was somehow all part of a big conspiracy and was to be discounted. And obviously all of this reached a hideous apotheosis in the attacks on the Capitol that he egged on that took place last week. And that was, an assault on the Capitol building of the United States. The last time that happened was in the War of 1812. The American government buildings have been, we've been very lucky. We haven't had a lot of war on American soil. We had the attack on the Pentagon, as well as on the World Trade Center on 9/11. And it's not that there haven't ever been people who wanted to do damage to the American Capitol, but we had a functioning system in which that didn't happen. but there haven't always been very many people who were Americans who wanted to do that kind of damage. You know, you win an election and you say, that's unbelievably wonderful. I'm excited to see what I can do next. Or you lose an election and you say with grace and dignity, what can I do to help whoever's going to come along after this? When Trump won over Hillary, the Obamas invited him for lunch at the White House, and Obama sat and talked to him about whatever there was to tell about the challenges of office. There was a very touching book published a couple of years ago that included notes that presidents had left, each of them for the next president, to say, you know, there's nothing else in the world like this job, and these are some things you might want to know going forward, and I wish you good luck. And Trump's attempt to undermine an actual election, you know, what effect will that have on people? There are a lot of people who believe that Joe Biden wasn't actually elected. And there are a lot of people who therefore are going to be very resistant to following his leadership. And that's a destruction of, you know, that's the most basic democratic norm, is that you have an election, the people express themselves, and unless there's real evidence that there was stuffing at the ballot boxes or deliberate manipulation, that everyone accepts that and there is a peaceful transfer of power. It's the first time in American history that from one president to the next, there has not been a peaceful transition of power. And Trump will be only the second president in American history not to attend the inauguration of his successor. And so I think the norms are all up for grabs. And I feel a lot of the time in the sort of liberal world of New York, like all of those, you know, all of those princesses I met when I was working in Leningrad, as it then was, and St. Petersburg afterwards, but who one day were sort of drinking tea in their palaces and thinking the system functioned, and the next day were hiding under a bridge and scrounging for food, with the exception that I think that was a completely, you know, the Russian pre-revolutionary system was deeply, deeply flawed. And I mean, all systems are deeply flawed, but American democracy pre-Trump was a relatively functional and good system. And I don't know what lies ahead.
Okay, but the election results showed a country almost perfectly split in half. But maybe this is, I don't know, a superficial look. Are there more colors in this picture? How divided is America today?
Excuse me. In the first place, it wasn't, I mean, it was not an overwhelming landslide for the Democrats, but I mean, Biden won by a very substantial margin. It was not a matter of a few votes here and a few votes there. The electoral college system, which is very baroque and confusing and which I think should be eliminated, it tends to make it sound closer than it actually was. But in terms of the popular vote, Biden won significantly. I mean, whenever you're looking at an American election, especially now as the two parties have moved so far apart, you know, it used to be that I would sort of say, well, I vote for Democrats mostly, but there's this moderate Republican who seems very good. There are no moderate Republicans now. I don't know what they're doing, the people who used to be moderate Republicans, but they're not hanging out where I'm hanging out, and I don't see them in the news. So when you have this very extreme split, I mean, I would say I literally can't imagine voting for a Republican now. And even 10 years ago, I wouldn't have said that. And certainly when I was growing up, I wouldn't have said it. I'm 57. So I think there's been this terrible polarization that's taken place where it's very extreme. And of course, it's not only in the United States. I mean, we've seen the same authoritarianism in Brazil and in Turkey and in Hungary and in
Great
Russia.
Britain, let's see.
In Great Britain, yes, absolutely. And, you know, it threatens in France and in Germany and in a variety of other places. Poland has been a disaster, I think. So this is something that's going on all over the world. I think the COVID situation has terribly exacerbated a problem that already existed and has made it much worse. I think people are sort of desperate, and when people are desperate, they act in extreme ways. But I mean, I do not envy Joe Biden his job. I'm glad that he won, and I'm delighted that he wants to have that job. But the idea of trying to pull America together at this point, it's also partly I mean, back to the media thing, but you know, the news that I watch on CNN, for example, or that I get reading the New York Times and the Washington Post is almost entirely unrelated to the news that's being communicated on Fox TV under the control of Murdoch and many other sort of more extreme channels. And so we're living in different realities. You know, there are all these people who follow the QAnon tendency in American right-wing politics and actually think that the Democrats are running pedophile rings and are involved in satanic worship. I mean, that's pretty extreme. To think the Democrats have foreign policies I don't agree with is one thing. To say even things that I feel very strongly about, but I understand where someone else doesn't. You know, I believe strongly in the right to choice for abortion, but I understand sort of where some other people have a different point of view on that. But here, it's not a matter of having a different point of view. It's living in a different reality and getting everyone back to the point. It's not even getting everyone to agree to how we will respond to the facts. It's getting everyone to agree to what are the facts. I think that's going to be a very steep job.
Let's see a little bit the film from the beginning. How did we get Donald Trump in the first place? I don't know. How was such a political leader possible? And more importantly, how much is a future Trump possible in America? Who made Trump so powerful? Politicians, people, social media, maybe?
Well, all of that and more. I mean, Donald Trump really got going as a television personality. So he had that sort of visibility that comes from having a public face and a public appearance. But I think a lot of it was a response to the Obama administration. A lot of it had to do with, I mean, I think he played the threat of racism. You know, he really got his political start when he started the birther conspiracy theory that Obama was not an American citizen and had not been born in the United States. You know, it seemed ridiculous that he was saying it, and he seemed like a ludicrous figure who was making these claims at the time. I certainly didn't think, I mean, I thought it was disgusting behavior, but I didn't think it was dangerous at the level it turned out to be. But I think that the composition of the United States is changing. It's changing dramatically and it's changing rapidly. And because of various demographic issues, white people are going to be in the minority by, I never remember what year, but 2035 or something like that. And the sense that if you were a sort of white heterosexual Christian male, you were one of the people who kind of could run things your own way is disappearing. And people feel disenfranchised and they feel frightened and they feel racist. But Trump really, I mean, he knows how to play on people's fears and anxieties. You know, I finally forced myself to watch some of his rallies, and you can just see him stirring up the sense of sort of, you deserve more. What you should have has been taken away from you. And, you know, Obama was, I mean, so honorable and so straightforward and so dignified and so insistent on truths that a lot of people didn't want to hear. And Trump tells people what they want to hear. And if it's not true, he tells it to them anyway. And there are a lot of people, I mean, the United States has become a much less socially mobile society. People are much more stuck in the class into which they were born. They're much more, it's much harder to get from the bottom to the top. You know, my grandfather rather immigrated from Romania, in fact, with very
from the
little,
I believe.
Yes, okay. Exactly. But he, at the time that he arrived in the United States, he had almost nothing, and I'm very lucky to have had a you know, very privileged life, and that social mobility has sort of disappeared to some degree in America. And many people feel that their children will have a less good life than they had rather than a better life. And they don't understand that that's because there are limits to how good life can be. And there's overpopulation and there's global warming. I mean, there are a million different factors that are contributing to that. But you know, they think that they Donald Trump said, you deserve more. And people who don't have that much love hearing you deserve more. He not only said you deserve more, he said, you deserve more, and I'm going to get it away from all those people who are taking it away from you, and I'm going to give it back to you. That message goes down very well. People like that. I deserve more. These other people who seem to be doing well have taken what should rightfully be mine. I'm going to get it back. And I think it was, I mean, you asked how he arose. I think the idea that we had that Black president for 8 years bothered a lot more people than we realized. And I think the fact that that president welcomed all kinds of difference and all kinds of people as difference. He wasn't actually so great on immigrants, but he was pretty good on lots of other minority groups or disadvantaged groups or underprivileged groups. And people thought, here he is creating, you know, entitlements for, I don't know, transgender people, and my salary has gone down. And, you know, people's salary has gone down in real terms for a million different reasons, including things like automation and breakdowns in the labor movement and all sorts of other things. But I think we get a Trump because I think people were frustrated and angry, and I think he's very good at playing on those frustrations.
What do you think about this decision of Facebook and Twitter to block Donald Trump's account? It is about Donald Trump or about freedom of speech?
Well, I mean, I think you may know I was president of PEN America, which is a major freedom of speech organization. In the first place, Twitter and Facebook are private companies. So the freedom of speech issue, you know, if I start a newspaper, I don't have to publish the opinions of people I disagree with. It's my newspaper. But beyond that, there is a very famous American Supreme Court case that was decided by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was one of the great justices in American history in, I think, the 1920s or 30s, in which he said freedom of speech does not include the freedom to shout fire in a crowded movie theater. And I think that Trump's use of that social media is being used to incite violence. It's being used to incite violence in which, you know, several people died in that raid on the Capitol, 2 policemen and at least 1 demonstrator. It violated all kinds of civil norms. There's a point, I mean, you know, to the best of my knowledge, Osama bin Laden wasn't interested in using Twitter, but if he had been, it would have seemed reasonable to close down his account after 9/11. And I just think it's, I think Donald Trump has plenty of platforms through which he can speak and plenty of advocates who will listen to him. And the social media companies have to recognize the way that social media have been used to achieve the kind of Trump revolution and do this terrible damage. And, you know, they had, I mean, I think you said to what extent is it about free speech and to what extent is it about Trump?
Yeah.
It's also, frankly, about their stock price. I mean, I think if Facebook and Twitter hadn't done this, a lot of people would have stopped using Facebook and Twitter in protest, and that the power of those companies would have been limited. So I don't think the companies were doing it out of pure idealism. I think it was a tactical move, but I think it's a perfectly reasonable tactical move. And certainly I would have been among the people who, if I felt that those companies didn't take any responsibility for the horrible things that were achieved on those platforms, I would have stopped using them.
Crises like this one, caused by coronavirus, can easily feed populism. How dangerous is that today? Because, you know, it seems easier, especially for vulnerable people, to turn to leaders promising easy solutions, or at least pointing to a common scapegoat.
Yes. I mean, scapegoating has been a very common strategy across, you know, many generations. I think that there are definitely all of those old-fashioned elements of scapegoating and of, you know, all of the cheap moves of populism. But I think they've been very difficult to control also, and this is partly an answer to your earlier question, because I think even though it's so woven into our lives, the internet is still relatively new. And if you look, for example, at the time the printing press was invented, and suddenly communications changed. You had religious wars in Europe that lasted over 100 years. And when you look at the invention of broadcast media, it was really radio in particular that was used to bring about Nazism and to propagate the ideas behind Stalinism. And so I think each time you have a new means of communication, some people are ahead of other people in figuring out how to use it for their own methods. And the general public doesn't understand how to deal with it or regulate it or make sense out of it until much later on. And so I think partly this move now around the world, and particularly in Trump's case, has had to do with people who are very canny about the way they use the internet. And people feel insecure. I mean, with global warming, who knows when large parts of the world are going to become uninhabitable. There's not going to be enough water. There's not going to be enough food. There are all of these other problems that are occurring with automation. There are not going to be enough jobs. The world population is raising at this geometrical rate. It's becoming enormous. It's becoming overwhelming. There are all of these problems that are really huge problems. And to have someone who says, those aren't really problems and I can fix everything, it's very attractive. It's very attractive, except that actually those are real problems, and actually he can't fix them. If I really believed that there were a leader, I mean, I wish I believed that Joe Biden could fix them. I don't think anybody can fix them except in small part and with enormous cooperation internationally. But if somebody came along and said to me, I can really solve all those problems, I don't know. I might give up some freedoms in order to have someone who could do that.
Yeah, it's easier to believe in fake news than to accept reality. But besides this political crisis, America is also hit, like the whole world, by a pandemic that has dramatically affected the American people in so many ways. What will the new post-pandemic life look like?
Oh, I wish I could answer that question with clarity. I mean, I wonder what it's going to look like post-pandemic. I mean, I'll give you a very miniature example, but in New York City right now, there are 300,000 people who worked in the restaurant industry. The restaurants in New York have been shuttered. If you were, maybe if you owned a restaurant, and a lot of the owners have then tried to give money to their employees to keep them going, even though there was no money coming in. So the restaurant owners are in a bad place, but the ones who are really in a terrible place are all of those workers. And there isn't another job for them to go to. The people who worked at the lowest level are mostly relatively uneducated, and they were busboys in restaurants. And what are they going to do now? They don't have another place to go. Other people were sort of working as waiters because they were trying to make it as actors. Well, there are no actors in New York either. That's all closed down. I think that the disruption this pandemic has created is enormous. And what's kind of revolting, I guess in both senses of the word, is that the pandemic has affected the people who are at the bottom of society much more than the people who are at the top of society. So for someone like me, and presumably the situation is not entirely dissimilar in Romania, but I don't know in any detail, but certainly for someone like, I'm writing my books, and my son does some of his schooling online, and my husband has the time to sit with him while he's doing his online schooling. And I miss seeing my friends and stuff, but it hasn't really had that much of a negative impact on my life. But enormous numbers of people who are uneducated and disadvantaged have lost their lives. If I want to get testing, it's a nuisance to arrange it right now in New York. You have to kind of make an appointment and call it, but I can always get a test. There are always these people who haven't been able to access the tests because they don't understand how the system works. They don't know when they should be getting them. And if you look at a map that shows where the most people have died, the most people have died in poor communities, and the fewest people have died in rich communities.
In Romania, if you have money, you can pay for getting tests, for example.
Right.
I paid, but many other people cannot afford the price of a COVID test.
Yeah.
My daughter too. She studies online, but there are many children who have no access to internet in Romania, for example.
So there are many children with no access to internet in the United States too. And also the whole, I mean, I don't know what your experience with your daughter is, but mine with my son is that, you know, the online teaching is not the same as in-person teaching. And so we sit at dinner and George says, well, he was talking about this today, but I didn't understand it. And I say, oh, that's really interesting. You know, actually, when I studied that, I remember such and such and so and so, and I'm a participant in his education. People who are not themselves educated are not able to supplement their children's education in that way. So it just, I mean, it's taking a terrible toll on people. The rate of death from COVID, if you are infected with COVID, the likelihood that you will die is, I don't remember the exact numbers, so don't quote me on the numbers, but I think it's almost twice as high if you're Black as it is if you're white.
Yeah, I saw.
And it's horrible.
Yeah, you know, in one of our interviews, you told me that for you, traveling is the opposite of depression. But people haven't traveled too much in the past year. Is there any other, I don't know, shield to depression?
Well, I mean, I can't even begin to say how much I miss traveling and how much I miss the friends who are abroad. And I've been corresponding even with friends in Romania. I have a good friend who comes and stays with us every year for a month, and she didn't come this year, and from Bucharest. But what are the other, I mean, I think the antidote to depression now in the middle of this crisis is activism. You know, the people I know, I mean, it's not the most rewarding form of activism, but I donated more money during this election cycle than I have ever even considered donating in any other election cycle. It seems so urgent. I got involved in a project sending postcards to people that didn't say whom to vote for. They just were to encourage people to vote, because of course, people who are less advantaged often don't vote, and the elections therefore don't reflect the will of the American people. I tried to write whatever I could about it. So, I mean, what are the real ways to address depression? You know, you can still address depression with things like medication and with psychotherapy and with all of the rest of those basic tools. But I think for people who have the freedom to do so, that becoming activist in the face of what really came to seem like a terrible evil has helped. And the other thing I think is that in terms of the pandemic itself, there has been an enormous issue on measures that are appropriate to preserve people's physical health. They have not been well enforced in the United States. They've become very politicized. There have been all kinds of problems, but the measures are there. There have been very few measures that have been put in place to preserve people's mental health. When the original breakout occurred in Wuhan, the Chinese authorities moved mental health workers into Wuhan to help deal with the pandemic. And there's a great body of literature, much of which I read, that was written before this pandemic began, that said on the basis of smaller outbreaks of illnesses like Ebola and so on, that said when there is something like this, the mental health costs are enormous, and that proposed ways to deal with those mental health problems. And one of them would have been to activate a network of mental health workers who could really talk to people about these problems, and to make the services of those workers available to the people who needed them. And it wasn't done. But additionally, I think sometimes you have to weigh the mental and physical health issues and decide in favor of the mental health one. So on the one hand, we're all supposed to stay completely isolated and not see anyone. And on the other hand, I have a friend who's barely left her apartment for 9 months, and it sounds like she's going quietly crazy. And I had a letter recently from someone who said that a friend of hers had been finding the isolation very difficult, and that she felt the friend was very depressed and tried to talk to the friend over email, and the friend stopped responding, and it turned out that she had hanged herself. And I just think terrible things are going on at that level. I mean, we made the decision excuse me, which was not an easy decision, and we were very torn about it. But to have some of our son's friends and their parents come and stay with us in the countryside where we are for various weekends, and we decided to do it because I felt like George, having no exposure to other children for this length of time, he was really coming unglued, and it was really worrisome. And I thought, okay, it would be safer not to have these additional people in our house. You know, there are lots of warnings not to do it, but it just, the mental health cost had become too enormous. So I think if we're talking about something dramatic, I think there's the activism, but at the other level, figure out how to sustain human contact, even at a time when human contact has become sort of a forbidden good.
Because we have to say that depression isn't really a bad mood, isn't just a bad mood. It's something more serious.
And in addition to the fact that people kill themselves, there was just a really good article in JAMA, which is one of the biggest medical journals in the English language, and that demonstrated once again the connection between depression and lowered immune function. So when you have a population where everyone is depressed, it's not only that they're having a bad time, it's also that they're much more likely to get something like COVID than they would be if they were less depressed. So there are even physical health ramifications to the whole thing.
Okay, Andy Solomon, it was really a privilege. Hope to see you soon, and hope to see you soon in Romania.
I was about to say,
maybe in Dorohoi. You know, I am from Dorohoi, so so we share something. We have something in common. Yes.
Well, perhaps we can go there together then. That would be a great experience for me. And if there's any occasion for you to come to the United States, I'll hope to see you here as well.
Yes, so. I hope to travel soon, me too. Thank you very much. It's been a joy.
Thank you.